Well, remember I told you in the previous clip, the BA, the British Aluminium, used to run a bus from the Bainsford plant down to Warrington. Well, as I said before, my dad used to bring me down here, and this was the actual street where we were all brought up. We were all born on this street. Tez, my nephew, brought me here just to see what it was like. And this is half of Cartwright Street where I was born, but this is the top end of it. The actual part of the street where we were born is behind the camera, but it was demolished some time ago and it's now just a car park, but the houses were all the same. And this is what my dad and his family, well, they were all brought up here. And just to think, during the last war, the First World War, every mail in these houses, that's just this street, they were all sent to the front line. And the biggest majority of them never came back. So you can imagine all the women in here and the families, they didn't have much money at all, no husbands there to get a wage coming and so on. They got a mere pension, I believe, from the army, but a little good that did. So everybody mucked in. They'd help each other. And to give you an idea, my dad lost his father when he was young. As you see, that was my dad's dad, my grandfather, and Annie South, my gran, as I'll show you some photos later on. That's my dad, and if you can just imagine his father killed in the war. My dad was the oldest. Then there was Annie, which was his sister. He had a brother called William, another brother called Richard, and another sister called Florrie. Now my dad, in a way, being the oldest, he had to try and take care of all the family, along with Gran, who was Annie South, Annie Gemmell in other words. But Annie remarried onto the Holroyds. I'll try and explain that in another clip, but it gives you an idea the involvement of the family with my dad. So it meant a lot for my dad to come back. He gave up everything to move up to Scotland to start the BA, along with fellow colleagues, of course. But one of the days he took me to the cemetery. He wanted to show me my gran's grave, my granddad's grave, all the ones I knew. So this is the cemetery in Manchester Road, Old Warrington Cemetery. All my family or relatives, they're all buried in this area, this green area, all here. And he took me to my gran's grave, which I'll show you in depth in the next wee clip. My gran and granddad, they're buried up about here somewhere, but all the rest of the family are all down here. And later on I'll do a wee clip. We discovered we had an older brother called Ronald, and he is buried in about here somewhere. I've got some photos, they're not very nice, but however, I managed to trace where all the family is, which is quite interesting, but it's like everything else, you open a can of worms, so to speak. But my dad took me there, and to me it was just a sight like anyone else. I was just holding his hand, he took me all the way down here. But when he'd laid his flowers and had a few moments with my granddad, all that sort of stuff, I just sat on the head, one of the stones next door while he was obviously talking to his mum and dad, so to speak. Anyway, we started to leave, and he says, I want you to show you something. And up about here, there was a big white stone, and I'll show you on the other clips that I'll make. He says, do you know who that is? Of course, I had no idea. He says, that's the grave of George Formby. And of course, his name meant nothing to me at that time. It was two-way. So he says, always remember that. Your gran and all your family's buried in the same cemetery as George Formby. And I never forgot that. But I'll try and explain that in my next wee clip. But what a size of a cemetery. But I've got another wee story, you'll see it. I'll try and show you in the clip in a wee while. But it all sort of came back to me, because the times I was going back to Warrington and Cartwright Street here, just to think we all played here. There was only 2 babies in the street born at that particular time, and that was me and Colin Gemmell. We stayed next door to each other. He was Richard's son, Richard Gemmell. You may remember him. He had a son, called him Richard too, Dick Gemmell as they called him. He was the famous rugby player who played for Britain. Anyway, that's another story. But when I was there, I looked all up and down here, and it was unbelievable, all the people that used to be there, who died during the war, that sort of thing. But I can remember my granddad. It was a house like this we stayed in, and he used to send me to the shop with a couple of empty malt bottles and a wee note and some coin. The shop was on the corner, and I'd hand the wee note over to the chap, and they would say, hold on. He'd go through the back of the shop, and he'd come back, and what they were, he must have had a barrel of beer or something. So we'd fill up lemonade bottles, malt bottles, anything, cups, anything. Obviously he'd charge you for them. And I carried them back to Grandad. And of course that's when I saw it was beer. Of course I never got any, but my dad and all, they all had a drink, and then they'd have a wee bottle of whiskey and so on. So they were all musically minded. Even my granddad, I can remember him. He could play the organ, he could play the piano, he could play the ukulele. He used to have that. And I actually saw him playing the spoons. He was good at that, I can remember that. But he also played what they called the comb. And that's just an ordinary comb you use for your hair. You wrap some paper around it, you wet it, and you sort of blow or make your lips vibrate against the comb, and you'll get a tune, and you could play any tune you wanted once you've done it a few times. And of course, there was a mouth organ. All musical it was. And I think that's how my dad picked it up. The family knows only too well my dad used to love playing the piano and the organ. We used to have that in Cross Street. And he didn't understand music at all, really, when you think of it. He couldn't read music, that's what I meant. But he could knock out a tune on a piano or an organ. Mind you, now and again it was like a wee Les Dawson, if you get my drift. But the sing-songs, I can remember them having, especially up in Scotland and Cross Street, when they used to have a car out on a Saturday. They used to gather in our house in Cross Street, and they'd get music on. Dad would be playing the piano there to sing song. And that usually happened on a Saturday. Of course, we were put to bed. Some of the memories there. But as I say, this is where my dad wanted to come. But I know now how if he must have felt he wanted to come here because all his family, relatives, uncles, they were all buried here in this part of the cemetery. But of course I know where his grave is now, but in my next wee clip I'll give you an idea as to how we found the cemetery, because years after it I could never remember where the cemetery was. It was only when I says to my relatives, George Formby's there, and then they all knew exactly where the cemetery was. After that, it was a matter of trying to find the grave. But that's an early story. By the new